We've talked a lot on this show about the impeachment process, and we've done so over the past few weeks. But as we move forward, a lot of people want to know, what does this mean for 2020? Specifically, how are voters impacted? Joining me right now is Kenny Cunningham. He's a Republican political analyst and founder of Cunningham Communications, a millennial. This is your first, as a voter, impeachment, as it is for most millennials. What's going through your mind? What are you thinking as you see what's going on?
I think millennials are not too different than the rest of the voting population. I think voter issues are also millennial issues. Obviously, it's our first one, so it's interesting to observe being impacted by what's going on. But I think ultimately we're not too different than the rest of the population. I think that there's definitely people on the hard left, there's people on the hard right, and there's a lot of us in between who see this as one way or the other. I think though that if we're looking at millennials just in general, I think that they're very results oriented. I think they're very focused on efficient results, and you have to wonder. Typically, I think that what you'll see is a skew towards the left a little bit with millennial voters. But I do wonder though, being the efficient results oriented generation that we are, you have to wonder if this political posturing by Democrats is going to hurt them at all with traditionally left of center voters. Kenny,
let me ask you this. Your own words, most millennials left of center. And I think it's fair to say most. Certainly most of the ones I've talked to. If you're trying to recruit them to give the president a look, okay, if you put gun control out there, if you put climate change out there, that puts them at stark contrast to the president. How do you get them to give the president a look?
I would contend that just a bit. I think what's misrepresented when it comes to millennials is the number one issue across the board is jobs and the economy. I don't think that's different with millennials. I think that climate change and gun control probably polls higher amongst millennials, but I think that jobs and the economy are just as important to millennials as they are the rest of the voting population. So, because if there's no opportunity for jobs, if there's no upward mobility, if you're not able to start your own business, then you don't have the luxury to be able to focus on these issues, these passion issues that are dear to you. So I would contend that I think the number one issue for millennials going into this election is the economy, is the jobs. And if you look at what the economy is doing right now,
you think that favors the president?
That favors the president. I mean, this is the strongest economy we've had in recent history. And so I think that in that token, I think that he's doing a very good job.
Okay, Kenny Cunningham, we got to get you come back.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. To be continued.